So right now, a 67-year-old master weaver in the Badamwari neighborhood of Srinagar, Kashmir, he's staring at an entirely empty loom.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, he has the raw silk, he has the specialized tools, he has decades of muscle memory in his hands, but he absolutely cannot work.
And why is that?
Because, roughly 1,500 miles away, in the skies over Kuwait, an Iranian drone just slammed into a massive oil refinery.
Right.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're looking at a truly massive stack of sources from today's news. Today is Saturday, March 21st, 2026, and our mission today is to show you exactly how the invisible wires of the modern world connect that exploding drone to that empty loom.
And more importantly, how those same wires connect directly to your wallet.
Exactly. Your wallet, your neighborhood, and your fundamental legal rights.
It is honestly the ultimate demonstration of just how hyper-connected and deeply fragile our global ecosystem really is.
Yeah, it is.
Like, we often talk about the butterfly effect, right, as this neat, abstract mathematical concept. But today, we aren't dealing with butterflies.
No, not at all.
We are dealing with ballistic missiles, massive infrastructure projects, and sweeping legal overhauls.
We really are taking the macro, the high-level geopolitics playing out in West Asia and bringing it right down to the micro.
Right.
We're going to explore how international conflict triggers local environmental battles, how top-down development is forcing our courts to fundamentally redefine what a family is or even what constitutes a crime.
Yeah, that legal section is wild.
It's huge. And finally, how all of this intense, real-world anxiety gets processed and reflected back to us in the movies we watch.
Which is so revealing.
It is. We are going deep into the mechanics of these events because you, listening right now, you need to understand the how and the why.
Yeah.
You aren't just an observer in this.
No, you are a primary stakeholder.
Exactly. So let's start with the global stage, because the shockwaves always start at the top.
They do. And the dominant narrative on the global stage right now is the severe escalation in West Asia.
Right.
Our sources detail the ongoing United States and Israeli war on Iran, which has now entered its third highly volatile week.
And to really understand where we are today, we kind of have to trace the timeline back to the catalyst.
Yeah, the starting point.
The reporting indicates this current intensified phase was triggered by the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, back on February 28th.
Right. And since then, the situation has just degraded from these proxy skirmishes into direct, heavy infrastructural warfare.
It has. And what's immediately striking in the sources is the massive cognitive dissonance between the rhetoric we're hearing and the reality on the ground.
Oh, absolutely. The rhetorical war is painting two entirely different pictures of reality.
Like two different planets.
Exactly. On one side, you have Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, publicly claiming that Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile capacities have been fundamentally decimated.
Decimated,
right. The implication being that Iran's offensive capabilities have been totally neutralized.
But, I mean, when you look at the actual data of what is happening in the airspace over the Gulf, decimated seems like a highly optimistic political framing.
To say the least.
Because Iran's new supreme leader, Ayatollah Mujtaba Khamenei, released a statement vowing to completely strip away the security of their enemies.
And they aren't just putting out press releases. Right?
Yeah. They're actively backing that rhetoric up with complex, long-range physical strikes. The sources confirm that Iran is not only continuing to manufacture missiles despite being under heavy bombardment, but they've actively shifted their strategy.
Right, they're targeting major energy sites in neighboring Gulf Arab states now.
Which changes everything.
Let's break down the mechanics of that strategy, actually, because it's a masterclass in asymmetric warfare.
Go for it.
So Iran knows it cannot match the combined conventional air superiority of the U.S. and Israel. It's just not possible.
Right, the math doesn't work.
Exactly, so they don't try to. Instead, they use relatively cheap, easily mass-produced drone technology to target incredibly expensive, geographically fixed, and economically vital infrastructure.
And the scale of these targets is just staggering. I mean, the sources detailed two distinct waves of Iranian drones that successfully sparked a massive fire at the Mina al-Amadi refinery in Kuwait.
Yeah, and we need to put that in context for people.
Please do.
This isn't a small local facility. Mina al-Amadi processes over 730,000 barrels of oil every single day.
Wow.
It is one of the absolute arteries of global energy. And alongside Kuwait, there are reports of intercepted drones targeting the oil-rich eastern province of Saudi Arabia.
So this strategy of asymmetric disruption, it's highly calculated.
Oh, entirely. By targeting the global energy supply chain, Iran is demonstrating that even if their domestic military leadership and infrastructure are taking heavy losses, they still retain the power to choke off the oil supply.
And scramble the global economy in the process.
Exactly. The message is visceral. It's basically, if our economy and security suffer, the entire world's economy will suffer.
Which brings us to the geopolitical tightrope that countries like India are forced to walk right now.
Yes.
We have a deeply analytical opinion piece in our sources today dissecting India's foreign policy response to this exact conflict. And it is a fascinating look at the friction between, historical loyalty and modern survival.
India's position is incredibly precarious here.
Airy.
The diplomatic debate centers entirely around this concept of strategic autonomy. Historically, India has maintained very strong, deep civilizational and economic ties with Iran.
Right, like they partnered on the Chabahar port, they shared cultural exchanges for decades.
Exactly. But the current Indian government is making highly calculated, arguably ruthless diplomatic moves today.
Yeah, the piece highlights a very specific glaring omission. The Indian government made a deliberate decision not to issue an official condolence for the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei.
Which is huge.
It is. In the world of international diplomacy, silence is an incredibly loud statement. And furthermore, the Indian Prime Minister actually visited Israel right around the time this conflict was escalating. He even addressed the Israeli Knesset.
And the author of the source material notes that the timing of this visit drew heavy criticism from traditional foreign policy observers.
Because they felt it completely abandoned the pretense of neutrality.
Right. But the author frames this shift through a very specific historical lens. They pull a quote from a letter written by India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, to Albert Einstein back in 1947.
Yeah, and that letter contains a profoundly blunt definition of statecraft. Nehru wrote that foreign policy is, at its absolute core, selfish.
Selfish.
Yeah, it does not follow morality. It follows the principle of national interest.
And if we look at the mechanics of India's national interest in 2026, the math heavily favors alignment with the West and the Gulf over Iran.
Walk us through that math.
Sure. First, you have energy security. India imports the vast majority of its oil, heavily reliant on Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Second, the diaspora. There are nearly 10 million Indians living, working, and sending billions of dollars in vital remittances from those Gulf states.
That's a massive economic pillar.
Exactly. And third, defense and trade. The U.S. is India's largest trading partner, and Israel has become a crucial, irreplaceable supplier of high-end, state-of-the-art defense technology and border security systems.
So the author is arguing the government has made a cold, mathematical calculation.
Yes. The economic and defense stakes with the U.S., Israel, and the Gulf simply outweigh the historical friendship with Iran.
But I really have to push back on this framing.
Okay, let's hear it.
Isn't strategic autonomy just a polite, diplomatic euphemism for sitting on the fence?
Some would say so.
I mean, or worse, a cowardly way of avoiding a moral stance. If India's largest trading partner is the U.S., and Israel is providing the defense tech, why play both sides?
Well...
Because when you try to carefully thread the needle and remain neutral, your own citizens are the ones who get caught in the crossfire. Literally.
You're talking about casualty.
Yes. The sources report the tragic death of an Indian citizen in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, who was killed by falling debris from an intercepted Iranian missile.
Yeah.
How long can a country claim autonomy when its own people are dying in foreign capital cities?
I mean, it's a completely valid critique, and it highlights the human cost of realpolitik in a very stark way.
It does.
But to defend the concept of strategic autonomy for a moment, it's not simply about cowardice. It's about avoiding absolute leverage.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if a nation of over 1 billion people completely aligns with one bloc, it loses its ability to negotiate. It becomes a junior partner rather than an independent actor.
Oh, yeah, I see that.
The tragedy in Riyadh is a sobering, horrifying reality of global conflict. But from a statecraft perspective, policymakers are weighing that tragic loss against the potential economic collapse of entirely alienating a major energy supplier or defense partner.
It is a grim utilitarian calculus.
The grimmest.
And that utilitarian calculus bleeds into the domestic economy almost instantaneously. Because the shock waves from those drones hitting Kuwaiti refineries don't just stay in the Gulf.
No, they land directly at the local petrol pump.
Exactly. Let's trace the mechanics of this for everyone. Because of the physical stress from the skyrocketing global oil prices, Indian oil marketing companies have been forced to hike prices. Premium petrol, the XP95 variant, has gone up by 2 to 3 rupees per liter.
Which is noticeable, but perhaps manageable for the demographic buying premium fuel. But the real story, the one that impacts the foundational economy, is the hike in industrial diesel.
Yes, exactly. The sources note a massive hike of about 22 rupees per liter for industrial diesel.
Wow.
Right. Now, the government assured the public that normal retail grades of petrol and diesel remain unchanged for now. But let's unpack why that 22 rupee industrial hike is basically a ticking time bomb for you, the listener.
Please do.
Industrial diesel is what powers the freight trucks that move every single item across the country. It powers the backup generators for manufacturing plants. It runs the massive irrigation pumps in the agricultural sector.
So when the cost of industrial diesel spikes by 22 rupees, the cost of transporting a truckload of tomatoes from a farm in Maharashtra to a market in Delhi skyrockets.
Yep.
The cost of running a textile loom increases. That cost is never absorbed by the logistics company.
Never.
It is always inevitably passed down to the consumer. So a drone strike in Kuwait on Tuesday means your grocery bill goes up on Friday.
That is the physical reality of the global supply chain.
It really is.
Which brings us back to the image we started with, the butterfly effect hitting the ground in the most unexpected, devastating way imaginable. Because while we can measure the impact on diesel prices, the geopolitical chess match happening over the Strait of Hormuz is also resulting in cultural casualties.
Cultural casualties, yes.
And this brings us back to the carpet weavers in Kashmir.
This is one of the most striking, poignant details in the entire stack of sources today.
You've really stuck with me.
We're looking at the artisan clusters in places like Badamuari and Srinagar. These are communities that have woven world-renowned carpets for generations.
Yeah.
But their art is inextricably linked to Iranian culture.
Let's explain how this actually works, because it's fascinating. These weavers don't just improvise their patterns. They rely on incredibly complex, mathematically precise design templates called the Taleim.
The Taleim.
Right. And the Taleim is essentially a coded language of knots written out on strips of paper, indicating exactly which color thread goes where. And the most intricate, highly prized Taleims originate from Iranian master workshops in cities like Kashan and Tabriz.
The Kashan and Tabriz designs are basically the architectural blueprints of the Kashmiri carpet industry. They dictate the floral motifs, the structural geometry, the very essence of the rug.
And with the ongoing war, what's happening to those blueprints?
Well, the supply chains, the communication networks, and in some cases, the physical existence of these Iranian workshops have been obliterated or severely disrupted.
And so the Kashmiri weavers are left totally stranded.
Completely.
They literally cannot weave their traditional rugs without these specific Persian blueprints.
Right.
You have an opinion, quote, in the sources from Donald Trump, criticizing NATO allies and calling them cowards over their reluctance to militarily secure the Strait of Hormuz. Prioritizing high-level military posturing and securing oil routes.
Always the oil routes.
Right. And meanwhile, a master artist in Srinagar has lost his livelihood because the geopolitical supply chain of art and shared human culture has been violently severed.
It perfectly illustrates Nehru's point about foreign policy being selfish.
It really does.
Nations will always mobilize aircraft carriers to protect an oil route. They will rarely lift a finger to protect the delicate, centuries-old transmission of art and cultural heritage. The threads of shared human culture are viewed simply as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of national security.
That is a profoundly tragic way to frame it, but it's an accurate one. And it serves as the perfect transition point.
Yeah.
Because while sovereign nations are launching missiles over global energy routes and international borders, an equally fierce and perhaps even more immediate battle over land, resources, and geography is happening right inside domestic borders.
Domestic borders, right.
We're seeing a massive friction between the environment and top-down development. So let's move to our second section and start in Goa.
Okay, so the conflict in Goa provides a perfect microscopic view of a macroeconomic problem. It centers entirely around a piece of state legislation known as Section Thumb 9A of the Town and Country Planning, or TCP Amendment Act of 2024.
And to understand the visceral anger of the local population here, you really have to visualize what is actually at stake.
Right.
The sources describe protesters, specifically from Pelum Village, sitting on a week-long hunger strike at Azad Maidan in Panaji. And they were using these stark, color-coded zoning maps to explain their terror to reporters.
What were they saying?
They were saying, our green canopies will turn yellow, then red, and they will sell it to make it gray.
Wow.
It is a terrifyingly clear visual articulation of deforestation and rapid concretization.
And to understand why this is happening, we have to look at the mechanics of Section 39A. Under this new amendment, the state government has created a fast-track pathway to permit the conversion of ecologically sensitive zones.
Like what kind of zones?
We are talking about land that has been traditionally and legally classified as orchards, natural forests, and vital green cover. Section 39A allows this land to be officially rezoned into settlement zones.
Which is really just a bureaucratic way of saying they can now be legally sold to massive real estate developers, bulldozed and turned into commercial complexes and luxury residential villas.
Exactly.
And the scale of this is not just a few isolated plots. According to the data compiled in our sources, applications have already been submitted to convert over 68 lakh square meters of land across Goa.
That is a staggering, landscape-altering swath of the state.
It's massive.
The crux of the protesters' argument is that Section 39A fundamentally subverts local democratic consent. A local architect and regional planner quoted extensively in the source explains the historical context.
Right.
Previously, if a massive real estate conglomerate wanted to build a project in a Goan village, they were legally required to go through the Gram Sabha.
And let's unpack the Gram Sabha for a second because it's important. It's not just an informal town hall.
No, not all.
It is the foundational democratic institution at the village level, made up of all registered voters in that area. It was designed to ensure that the people who actually live on the land have a say in how it is utilized.
Exactly. It required deep community consultation. But critics argue that Section 39A allows private landowners and massive developers to bypass the Gram Sabha entirely.
Just skip it altogether.
Yep. They can approach the centralized TCP department directly, request a zoning change, and completely sidestep the local villagers who rely on that specific local ecosystem for their survival.
The sources actually mention a highly illustrative example in Ella Village, which is situated near Old Goa. Wealthy buyers and developers are purchasing entire hilltops simply to secure a scenic, panoramic view of the Mandovi River for their luxury villas.
Yeah.
But as one local resident pointed out to the reporters, they are, quote, buying views at the cost of destroying the environment.
Let's trace the physical mechanics of why building a villa on a Goan hilltop is so destructive.
Let's do it.
So the geography of Goa is heavily defined by laterite hills. Laterite is a highly porous rock. During the intense monsoon season, these forested hills act like massive natural sponges.
Okay, sponges.
Right. The dense root systems of the trees hold the topsoil in place, and the water slowly percolates down through the laterite to recharge the underground aquifers. That's the water table that the villages below rely on for their wells.
So when a developer buys that hilltop, the very first thing they do is chop down the tree canopy to clear space and improve the view. By doing that, they kill the root system holding the soil. Then they pave over the porous laterite with impermeable concrete.
Exactly. And the cascading effects are immediate. Without the roots, the next monsoon triggers massive soil erosion and devastating landslides, which we are seeing more frequently.
Wow.
Because the ground is paved, the water can't percolate, so the underground aquifers dried up, leading to severe drinking water shortages for the locals.
And finally, because the water can't soak into the hill, it rushes down the surface as rapid runoff, causing flash floods in the low-lying villages.
It is a textbook tragedy of the commons. And it's heavily accelerated by top-down legislative changes that prioritize short-term real estate capital over long-term ecological stability.
I think the best analogy here isn't just, redecorating a house by selling load-bearing walls.
No. What is it?
It's more like being on a large wooden lifeboat, and someone decides they want a better view of the ocean, so they start tearing up the floorboards to build themselves a raised platform. Right. Sure, they get a great temporary view, but they've destroyed the structural integrity of the vessel that is keeping everyone from drowning.
That is a grim but highly accurate metaphor. And it applies flawlessly to our next source, which takes us from the laterite hills of Goa to the incredibly pristine, deeply isolated islands of the Andaman and Nicobar archipelago.
Yep.
Specifically, we need to look at what is happening on Great Nicobar Island.
This is a monumental story that feels completely underreported.
Severely underreported.
The central government is aggressively pushing a 92,000 crore rupee, that's roughly $11 billion mega infrastructure project on Great Nicobar. This involves a transshipment port, an international airport, a power plant, and a massive greenfield township.
It's huge.
And the physical footprint of this project is displacing a fascinating, complex cross-section of humanity.
Yeah, the first group facing displacement are the ex-servicemen settlers. And to understand who they are, we have to look at the geopolitical strategy of the late 1960s and 70s. The Indian government recognized the strategic naval importance of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, sitting right at the edge of the Malacca Strait. To secure a civilian, patriotic presence, the government actively incentivized retired military personnel and their families to move from the mainland and settle on Great Nicobar between 1969 and 1975.
They were essentially sent there as human flags to claim and cultivate the land for national security.
Precisely.
And now, half a century later, the government is acquiring their land for this new mega project. And the settlers are, quite understandably, deeply furious about the financial terms of their displacement.
The sources outline the stark financial disparity here.
Walk us through the numbers.
The government is currently offering these settler families compensation ranging between 113 and 180 rupees per square meter for their developed land,
Which is absurdly low. The settlers are pointing out that in other parts of the Andaman Islands, land acquired for basic commercial tourism fetches tens of thousands of rupees per square meter.
Tens of thousands.
Yeah, so they're demanding a minimum baseline compensation of 1 crore rupees per acre, arguing that the government's offer doesn't even begin to cover the cost of relocating and starting over on the mainland.
But here is where the narrative becomes profoundly complex and ethically fraught.
How so?
Because while these settler families are utilizing the democratic process to fight for fair financial compensation for the land they cultivated, the very same 92,000 crore project is silently alienating the land and resources of the original indigenous inhabitants of the island.
The people who were there long before the 1970s.
Exactly.
We're talking about the Shompen and the Great Nicobarese tribes. And the situation with the Shompen is entirely unique. They're classified as a particularly vulnerable tribal group, or PVTG.
Let's explain what that means, because it's not just a standard scheduled tribe designation.
Right.
A PVTG classification is given to communities that are essentially pre-agricultural. They are nomadic hunter-gatherers, they have a stagnant or declining population, and they are largely isolated from mainstream civilization.
Their entire existence, their culture, their cosmology, and their physical survival are inextricably, totally dependent on specific tracts of virgin forest and coastline.
Right. And the sources report a deeply alarming statistic. Nearly 84 square kilometers of legally notified protected tribal reserve land is being systematically de-notified by the government to make way for this mega project.
Which critics argue is a blatant violation of the Forest Rights Act.
Absolutely.
The author of the opinion piece covering this issue makes an incredibly sharp observation about the difference in stakes here. The ex-servicemen settlers want better financial compensation.
Which is a quantifiable, negotiable demand.
Exactly. But how do you compensate the Shompen? They are a hunter-gatherer tribe. They operate entirely outside the capitalist system. They do not want, use, or understand the concept of fiat currency.
Right.
You cannot give them a bank transfer to make up for bulldozing the forest where they hunt and forage. For them, the loss of the forest isn't an inconvenience or a bad real estate deal. It is an existential extinction event.
And yet, the reporting indicates that local administrative agencies, and even some representatives of the settler communities, have reportedly signed documents giving consent to free up this protected tribal land.
Just sign it away.
Yeah. The author concludes with a chilling assessment. They say that local communities, and especially indigenous rights, are consistently treated as minor pawns in the larger geopolitical and development agendas of the state.
It is the ultimate friction between local human survival and top-down macroeconomic development.
Yes.
The state decides it needs a transshipment port to compete with China, and a 10,000-year-old uncontacted culture is deemed an acceptable casualty.
It's devastating.
And we see another angle of this exact same friction between ecology and industry in the Supreme Court's recent, highly aggressive intervention regarding the National Chambal Sanctuary.
Yes. The National Chambal Sanctuary is a unique tri-state protected area bordering Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Uttar Pradesh. It is a riverine ecosystem that is absolutely critical for the survival of the gharial.
And the gharial is a critically endangered, highly specialized species of fish-eating crocodile with that distinctive, long, thin snout. They are incredible creatures, but their breeding process is highly vulnerable.
And that vulnerability is being ruthlessly exploited by the illegal sand mining mafia. The sources detail how illegal miners are using heavy machinery to dredge sand from the riverbed and the banks.
Let's trace the mechanics of why sand mining destroys the gharial. These crocodiles don't build nests in the jungle. They rely entirely on the soft, pristine sandbanks of the Chambal River to lay and incubate their eggs.
Right.
When the mining mafia dredges the riverbanks, they are literally scooping away the only place on Earth these animals can reproduce.
Yeah.
Furthermore, the massive mechanical dredgers alter the flow and depth of the river, destroying the fish populations that the gharials feed on.
And the situation has become so dire that the Supreme Court of India has stepped in with a stark, unprecedented warning.
What did they say?
The court directly addressed the top officials of the forest, mining, and police departments across Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and UP. They stated that the ongoing lethargy and inaction of these officials in stopping the illegal mining makes them vicariously liable for the environmental destruction.
Wow, vicarious liability. That is a massive legal threat.
It really is.
Vicarious liability essentially means the court is saying, we aren't just going to prosecute the tractor drivers stealing the sand. If you, the chief conservator of forests or the district police chief, allow this habitat to be destroyed by intentionally looking the other way, you are legally aiding and abetting the crime.
Exactly. You will be held personally accountable. It is a profound shift in environmental jurisprudence.
For sure.
The court is attempting to force personal accountability onto the bureaucracy, recognizing that environmental laws are useless if the state apparatus is complicit in their violation.
And speaking of the state apparatus, our final story in this section is about an intense, high-stakes institutional turf war happening right inside the central government, far away from the forests of Chambal, but equally vital to the environment.
Right. The sources report a major bureaucratic clash.
Let's get into it.
So the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, the MNRE, is aggressively demanding sweeping new powers over the Electricity Act of 2003. Now, historically and currently, the Ministry of Power exercises primary overriding authority over the entire act.
Which includes managing the national grid and integrating connected renewable energy.
Right, but the MNRE is pushing back. They want to be legally recognized as the central government for absolutely all matters pertaining to renewable energy.
That's a big ask.
It is. They want the independent power to design electricity markets, frame tariff guidelines, and oversee the massive planning required for the transmission grid.
So why the sudden power grab?
Well, to understand the MNRE's argument, we have to look at the physics and economics of the modern power grid. The MNRE points out that non-fossil fuel sources like solar, wind, hydro now make up over half of India's total installed generation capacity.
That's impressive.
It is. However, and this is the crucial mechanical point, they only generate about 25% of the actual electricity flowing through the wires.
Wait, let's unpack that discrepancy. Why does 50% capacity only equal 25% output?
Because of the variable nature of renewables. A coal plant provides baseload power. You turn it on, shovel in coal, and it provides a steady, predictable output 247.
Makes sense.
The national grid operates at a strict frequency around 50 hertz. If supply and demand don't match perfectly second by second, the frequency fluctuates, and the entire grid can collapse in a cascading blackout.
Right.
Now, solar and wind are intermittent. If a massive cloud covers a solar park in Rajasthan, gigawatts of power drop off the grid instantly. If the wind stops blowing in Tamil Nadu, the turbines start.
So you can't just plug a massive solar farm into the grid the same way you plug in a coal plant.
Exactly. You need complex market designs, you need massive battery storage infrastructure, and you need peaker plants that can spin up in minutes to cover the solar drop-off.
And the MNRE's argument is that the Ministry of Power is structurally biased toward traditional baseload generation like coal.
Yes. The MNRE claims that to reach India's ambitious target of 500 gigawatts of clean energy capacity by 2030, they need institutional clarity.
Right.
They need the regulatory power to design a market that financially rewards battery storage and flexible generation, rather than just subsidizing coal.
But the Power Ministry, understandably, refuses to hand over the keys to the national grid, arguing that bifurcating the management of a single interconnected electrical system is a recipe for disaster.
If we synthesize all four of these domestic stories, the zoning laws paving over Goa's laterite hills, the mega project threatening the Nicobar ecosystem and the Shumpin, the sand mining destroying the Chambal gharials, and the bureaucratic war over managing the variable physics of the renewable energy grid, we see one single, unifying, profound theme.
And what is that theme?
It's the concept of carrying capacity.
Carrying capacity. It's an ecological term, but it applies to everything we've discussed.
It does.
It asks the fundamental question: how much development, How much resource extraction, how much sheer human weight can a specific system sustain before its underlying architecture fundamentally fractures and collapses?
Perfectly stated.
In Goa, the villagers are screaming that their local aquifers simply do not have the carrying capacity to supply water to endless luxury villas. In Nicobar, the fragile island ecosystem does not have the carrying capacity to absorb a 92,000 crore concrete infrastructure onslaught without erasing an ancient indigenous tribe.
Right.
In Chambal, the river has lost its carrying capacity to breed wildlife because the physical sand is being stolen to build our cities. And even in the air-conditioned corridors of power in Delhi, the national electricity grid is struggling with the carrying capacity of integrating massive, unpredictable solar power alongside rigid coal infrastructure.
It is the ultimate friction of the 21st century, the collision between infinite economic ambition and finite physical reality.
And when that carrying capacity breaks down, when the well runs dry, when the forest is cleared, when the electricity market fails, citizens inevitably turn to the justice system for relief.
They do.
But what happens when the justice system itself is undergoing a massive, fundamental identity crisis about what a citizen's rights actually are?
That is the big question.
And that brings us to our third section, redefining justice, rights, and accountability.
We are currently witnessing a profound, real-time evolution of the social contract in India, playing out across various courtrooms, high courts, and legislative assemblies.
The sources provide several fascinating case studies showing how the state is struggling to map archaic laws onto modern realities. Let's start with a landmark, truly beautiful ruling from the Supreme Court that completely dismantles and rebuilds the legal concept of motherhood and family.
Yeah, the court legally recognized maternity leave as a basic, fundamental human right for adoptive mothers.
Which is so important.
To understand the gravity of this, look at the rule they struck down. Previously, the statutory rules only allowed a woman to take maternity leave if she adopted a child who was under the age of 3 months.
Which is an incredibly cruel and, frankly, legally blind restriction.
Yeah.
Because anyone who has ever interacted with the legal adoption system in India knows that the bureaucratic process, the background checks, the matching, the court approvals almost always takes significantly longer than 3 months.
Oh, absolutely.
By the time a mother legally brings her child home, the child is almost certainly older than 3 months, which meant the mother was instantly disqualified from receiving paid leave to bond with her new child.
The Supreme Court recognized this absurdity and struck the restriction down entirely. They ruled that adoptive mothers are entitled to the full 12 weeks of paid maternity leave, regardless of the child's age at the time the adoption is finalized.
That's a huge win.
But the actual text of the judgment, the legal philosophy behind it, is what makes this truly revolutionary. The judges explicitly framed adoption not as a secondary option, but as a valid, equal expression of reproductive autonomy.
That specific phrasing, reproductive autonomy, is incredibly powerful.
It is.
They noted that the emotional bond between a mother and an adopted child doesn't happen automatically. It must be consciously nurtured through dedicated time and physical presence.
Right.
And then the bench delivered this incredible quote, which I want to read directly. "It is not biology that constitutes a family of a mother, father, and children. Rather, it is the shared meaning, responsibility, and emotional bonds that sustain such a relationship."
Shared meaning.
Shared meaning.
It is a complete paradigm shift. The highest court in the land is officially moving the legal definition of a family away from the sheer mechanics of genetics and biology and anchoring it firmly in the realm of conscious, chosen responsibility.
And they even took a step further, urging the central government to legally formulate and recognize paternity leave, noting that parenthood is not a solitary function meant only for the mother.
It is a massive institutional leap toward a modern, gender-neutral, psychologically sound understanding of parenting.
However, while the Supreme Court is successfully dragging family law into the 21st century, other parts of the legal system are experiencing severe, dangerous growing pains during their own transitions.
Very true.
The sources detail a case currently before the Delhi High Court that exposes a massive legal lacuna, a gaping hole in the country's brand new criminal code.
Right. In July 2024, India undertook a massive legal overhaul, completely replacing the colonial-era Indian Penal Code, the IPC of 1860, with the new Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, or BNS.
And the controversy centers around a very famous or infamous piece of legislation, Section 377 of the old IPC.
Historically, 377 was the law that criminalized unnatural sex. Now, we all know that a few years ago, the Supreme Court delivered a historic judgment, Nafteh Singh Johar, which decriminalized consensual same-sex relations between adults under 377.
Right.
But, and this is the vital distinction, while consensual acts were decriminalized, Section 377 remained on the books specifically to prosecute non-consensual unnatural acts.
Okay, so it was the primary legal tool used when a man was sexually assaulted, or when members of the LGBTQ+ community faced sexual violence that didn't fit the traditional, gender-specific legal definition of rape under the IPC.
Exactly.
So what happened with the new BNS? How does a massive omission like that occur?
The petitioner in the Delhi High Court pointed out that when the government drafted the new BNS, they simply omitted any equivalent to Section 377 entirely.
Wait, they just deleted it?
Yeah, they just deleted the entire section. I mean, it seems that in their zeal to remove the colonial stigma of criminalizing homosexuality, the drafters used a blunt instrument. They completely failed to realize that by doing so, they were erasing the only legal protection available for male victims of sexual assault and non-consensual unnatural offenses.
I have to pause and trace the mechanics of this failure. Does this happen because when a government tries to rewrite an entire nation's penal code in one massive push, they're essentially using a find-and-replace tool on a 160-year-old document?
Basically, yes.
And in doing so, without rigorous parliamentary debate and granular review, they accidentally delete load-bearing legal columns.
That is precisely the danger of rushed omnibus legislation. Law is a delicate ecosystem. If you pull out one thread without understanding what it's attached to, the whole fabric unravels.
Absolutely.
And the Delhi High Court was visibly frustrated with the central government's lethargy in fixing this. The court noted that they had explicitly directed the center to address this massive blind spot a year and a half ago.
And what was the government's response?
During the current hearing, the government's lawyers simply responded that it's a sensitive issue and they are still inviting inputs from stakeholders.
The court's response was basically, a year and a half is more than enough time to make a decision.
Exactly.
It highlights a terrifying reality, that modernizing a legal code can accidentally strip away vital protections from the most vulnerable and marginalized communities, leaving them completely legally defenseless while bureaucrats hold endless committee meetings.
We see another highly nuanced debate about legal protection, vulnerability, and marginalized communities in a separate Supreme Court case, this one regarding hate speech.
Right.
A petitioner approached the court seeking a very specific intervention, asking for legal protection against hate speech targeting the Brahmin community. The petitioner coined a specific term for this alleged phenomenon, Brahmophobia, and argued it should be legally treated as a specific form of caste-based discrimination.
And the Supreme Court completely dismissed the petition. But the dialogue during the hearing, as detailed in the sources, is fascinating because it touches on the philosophy of how a society manages offensive speech.
Justice B.V. Nagarathna orally observed that the legal fight against hate speech must be universal, not siloed.
What did she say exactly?
She asked the petitioner, why should a particular community come up and say, protect my community against hate speech? Rather, we should say, no one should indulge in hate speech.
So Justice Nagarathna essentially refused to frame the eradication of hate speech as a matter of creating endless, specific micro-laws for every single aggrieved community.
Right. She argued that managing speech is a broader societal goal dependent on education, intellectual development, and foundational tolerance. She even went so far as to advise the petitioner to develop the capacity to not be influenced by it, noting that legally reacting to every offensive comment often just triggers a cyclical reaction bogging down the courts.
Okay, I have to step back and ask a massive structural question about the health of our democracy based on these three cases.
Please do.
Because I keep seeing the exact same pattern. And I want to push back on the role of the judiciary here. Are our courts increasingly being forced to act as the exhausted parents of the nation?
That's an interesting way to put it.
Think about the evidence we just reviewed. The Supreme Court had to step in and redefine maternity leave because the legislative branch couldn't be bothered to update an archaic rule to reflect the reality of modern adoption.
Yeah.
The Delhi High Court is having to aggressively scold the central government to fix a gaping, dangerous hole regarding sexual assault in a brand new criminal code that the legislature rushed through.
Right.
And now the Supreme Court is literally lecturing citizens on building tolerance and emotional resilience against hate speech because societal discourse has degraded so severely.
That's a lot.
It seems the judiciary is constantly frantically rushing around with a bucket, trying to catch the water leaking from the massive structural gaps left by lawmakers who aren't doing their jobs, and a society that is fracturing.
Mm-hmm.
Is this level of judicial intervention actually healthy for a functional democracy?
It is a phenomenal, penetrating question, and the short answer is no, it is not healthy.
I can think so.
In a perfectly balanced textbook democracy, you have a clear separation of powers. The legislature proactively debates and crafts nuanced, airtight laws. The executive branch efficiently and fairly implements those laws, and the judiciary sits quietly in the background, merely interpreting the law when rare, complex disputes arise.
But that is clearly not what is happening.
Exactly. What we see in these sources is the reality of a highly stressed system. We have a hyperactive judiciary that feels compelled to practice judicial activism because the other branches are failing.
Right.
When legislatures pass laws without proper debate, like the BNS omission, or fail to update welfare laws like the adoption rules, a vacuum is created. And nature abhors a vacuum.
So the courts step in.
The courts are stepping into that void to prevent a collapse of fundamental rights. It is necessary in the short term to protect citizens, but in the long term, having unelected judges constantly making policy decisions warps the democratic structure.
And we can actually see the judiciary itself acutely aware of this tension, actively trying to manage that stress and protect its own institutional optics and integrity.
Look at the recent actions of the Chief Justice of India, Surya Khan.
Yes, the sources report a highly significant procedural move. The Supreme Court was scheduled to hear petitions challenging a controversial new 2023 law regarding the appointment of the Chief Election Commissioner and other election commissioners.
The controversy stems from the fact that this new law essentially removed the Chief Justice of India from the 3-member selection panel, replacing the CJI with a union cabinet minister nominated by the Prime Minister.
Which mathematically gives the executive branch, the ruling government, a 2-to-1 upper hand in appointing the people who oversee the nation's elections.
Exactly. The petitioners argued that this new law deliberately diluted a previous Constitution bench ruling that explicitly included the CJI on the panel to ensure absolute neutrality and independence of the Election Commission.
It is a massive constitutional challenge. But when the case came up, CJI Surya Kant officially recused himself from hearing the petitions.
And his reasoning was fascinating. He stated that since the core of the legal challenge directly relates to the removal of the specific office of the Chief Justice from the panel, he did not want a bench headed by him to hear the case.
He is deliberately avoiding any accusation of bias. He marked the case to be heard by a different bench where the presiding judge is not in line to become the future CJI.
It is a highly strategic move to protect the optics of absolute impartiality in a politically explosive environment.
And we see another example of the judiciary stepping in to manage sensitive national narratives, this time involving a former Supreme Court judge.
Yes, former Justice Indu Malhotra has been appointed to join a high-level expert committee finalized by the NCERT. Her specific mandate is to help finalize the curriculum on legal studies for 8th grade students.
And the context for this appointment is wild.
It really is.
The Supreme Court actually took suo motu cognizance, meaning they actively initiated a case on their own without a petition being filed, because a previous unreleased version of this 8th grade textbook contained a chapter explicitly titled Corruption in the Judiciary.
The court was outraged. They felt the chapter was deliberately calculated to create a foundational bias against the justice system in the impressionable minds of young students, and they ordered a blanket nationwide ban on the book. Now, they are ensuring top legal minds oversee the rewrite.
It perfectly encapsulates your earlier point. We have courts defining the philosophy of family, plugging holes in the criminal code, regulating the boundaries of hate speech, judging the mechanics of election oversight, and literally editing middle school textbooks.
The scope of judicial intervention in daily Indian life is truly staggering.
But the demand for fairness and accountability isn't solely falling on the courts. We are seeing state legislatures being forced to respond to massive public anxiety.
Look at Chhattisgarh.
Right. The state assembly just unanimously passed an incredibly draconian bill designed specifically to curb cheating in recruitment exams and admissions to higher education.
The penalties outlined in this bill are exceptionally severe. We're talking about up to 10 years in prison and crushing financial fines of up to 1 crore rupees for anyone found guilty of leaking question papers, tampering with evaluation records, or organizing sophisticated cheating rings.
why such extreme measures?
Because in a country with massive youth unemployment and a fiercely competitive job market, government exams are viewed as the only reliable ladder to economic security.
Yeah.
When paper leaks happen, which they do frequently, it doesn't just anger people, it shatters the fundamental belief in a meritocracy.
Yeah.
The 10-year jail term is the state's desperate attempt to restore faith that playing by the rules still matters.
And in Maharashtra, we saw the demand for accountability play out swiftly in the political sphere. The chairperson of the State Commission for Women, Rupali Chakankar, was forced to step down from her position after facing massive, sustained public backlash.
The optics of her situation were impossible to survive. Videos surfaced online showing Chakankar allegedly participating in a ritual where she washed the feet of a self-proclaimed godman.
The massive problem is that this specific godman is currently under arrest, facing severe criminal charges, including the rape and blackmail of several women.
It was an absolute, irreconcilable conflict of interest. You cannot have the head of the state's primary women's rights panel publicly venerating a man accused of systemic sexual violence against women. The public pressure mounted rapidly, and she was forced to resign.
All of these stories we've discussed in this section, from the right of an adoptive mother to bond with her child, to the desperate attempt to stop exam cheating, to the demand that leaders not worship accused predators, are ultimately about the exact same thing.
Which is?
They are about the messy, ongoing struggle for basic dignity, fairness, and the recognition of humanity. And our sources provide a deeply powerful historical echo to remind us that this is not a new struggle.
Yes, the sources explicitly noted that this week marked the 99th anniversary of the Mahad Satyagraha. Let's delve into what happened 99 years ago because the historical context is vital.
Absolutely.
In 1927, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar led a massive, peaceful civil rights movement in Mahad, Maharashtra. The goal was incredibly simple, yet revolutionary. He was fighting for the right of dalits, who were brutally oppressed by the caste system, to simply walk up to the public chavadar tail tank and drink the water.
The historical reality of that time was grotesque. The caste rules dictated that animals, cattle, dogs were freely allowed to drink from the public water tank, but human beings belonging to marginalized castes were violently prohibited from touching it.
Under the belief that their very presence would pollute the water.
Right. Ambedkar's act of leading thousands of dalits to drink from the tank was a direct physical challenge to the core architecture of untouchability.
The sources mention that even today, 99 years later, people traveled hundreds of kilometers this week to gather at Mahad to sing songs on the steps of that exact lake. They're keeping the memory of that struggle alive.
And if we connect the dots, we see that the 99-year-old Mahad Satyagraha and today's Supreme Court ruling on adoption are, at their philosophical core, fighting the exact same battle.
They really are.
They are both forcing the state and society to expand its definition of humanity. It's a slow, agonizingly painful process of forcing the system to recognize the inherent dignity of every individual, whether that's an adoptive mother demanding the right to nurture, a marginalized tribe in Nicobar fighting for their forest, or a citizen in 1927 demanding the basic right to hydrate without being treated worse than livestock.
That is a brilliant synthesis.
Yeah.
The long arc of the social contract.
Yeah.
But as we move to our final section, we have to acknowledge that these complex, visceral, real-world battles over rights, justice, geopolitical borders, and national identity, they don't just stay neatly confined to courtrooms or history books.
No, they don't.
They are actively processed, digested, and reflected back to the masses through the stories we consume on screen. So let's look at the cultural mirror.
The sources provide a highly revealing juxtaposition of two vastly different pieces of cinema currently making headlines, and more importantly, they analyze how the Indian state and society interact with these different narratives.
Right.
First, we have a detailed, highly critical review of a massive new mainstream Bollywood release titled Dhurandhar: The Revenge.
This film is directed by Aditya Dar and stars Ranveer Singh in the lead role. And I want to be extremely clear here for the listener. We are strictly presenting the viewpoint and analysis of the film reviewer as written in the source material.
Absolutely.
We are not endorsing this view, nor taking a political stance. We are simply reporting on the cultural analysis provided. And the reviewer's analysis of Dhurandhar is absolutely scathing.
It is. The reviewer describes the film as a grueling 4-hour maximalist exercise in revenge fantasy. The plot follows an undercover Indian agent who infiltrates, ruthlessly brutalizes, and eventually dominates the criminal underworld in Karachi, Pakistan.
The source material describes the film as being utterly drenched in gratuitous, hyper-stylized violence. The reviewer provides a vivid summary of the experience, writing, "One went for a story, returned with a migraine and a beard."
They do praise Ranveer Singh's physical commitment to the role, calling him a homegrown Rambo, but they are deeply, fundamentally critical of the film's underlying ideological messaging.
The review explicitly characterizes the film as a cinematic propaganda mouthpiece, perfectly aligned with the aggressive posturing of the current ruling political ecosystem.
The author argues that the film's primary function is to lionize extrajudicial killings and aggressive counter-terror operations, framing extreme violence not as a tragic necessity, but as an absolute moral imperative and a source of nationalistic joy.
And crucially, the reviewer notes a highly dangerous narrative technique used in the film. They argue that Dhurandhar intentionally blurs the lines between Indians and Hindus while simultaneously blurring the line between Pakistani terrorists and ordinary Indian Muslims.
By conflating these identities, the film creates a monolithic enemy.
Furthermore, the source argues the film actively commodifies real-world national grief, the trauma stemming from actual historical terror attacks, and cynically packages that trauma into hyper-violent entertainment designed for massive box office profit.
The reviewer describes it as giving the masses a high-budget dramatization of the manufactured rage you usually find scrolling through toxic social media feeds.
What we are analyzing here is a textbook example of soft power and narrative control. Cinema is never created in a vacuum, and box office success is an indicator of societal appetite.
A massive mainstream film that glorifies extrajudicial violence and moral absolutism in a neighboring country tells us a tremendous amount about the subconscious anxieties and the preferred self-image of a large segment of society.
It provides the audience with a comforting fantasy of absolute, unstoppable power and clear moral binaries in a geopolitical world that is, as we discussed in the very first section with the drone strikes and oil prices, actually incredibly murky, fragile, and full of tragic compromises.
But the contrast provided by the sources is what makes this truly jarring, because while this 4-hour fictional buffet of jingoistic violence is running to packed theaters across the country, completely unimpeded, another film is being systematically suppressed by the state apparatus.
The sources report extensively on the ongoing censorship of a documentary film titled The Voice of Hend Rajab. This is not a fictional revenge saga. This is an Oscar-nominated documentary about a very real, very specific, and highly tragic event. The killing of a 5-year-old Palestinian girl, Hend Rajab, by Israeli forces during the Gaza war early in 2024.
The film's Indian distributor spoke to the reporters and stated that the Central Board of Film Certification, the CBFC, commonly known as the Censor Board, has orally rejected the film, refusing to grant it a certification for public viewing.
Furthermore, the sources note that this isn't a recent issue. Multiple prestigious Indian film festivals were blocked from screening this specific documentary over the past year because they simply could not get the necessary clearance and exemption from the Information and Broadcasting Ministry.
The distributor pointed out a crucial bureaucratic difference. In a past instance involving a different controversial film, the censor board explicitly rejected it in writing, officially claiming the film could cause communal issues, which at least provided a legal basis to challenge the decision in court.
But with The Voice of Hend Rajab, the rejection was oral. This tactic leaves the film stranded in bureaucratic limbo, unable to be screened, but without a formal rejection letter to legally appeal, though a senior official later told the reporters it has supposedly been referred to a revising committee.
It's a classic bureaucratic stall tactic.
I have to use an analogy here to highlight the mechanics of what this means for a society, because the juxtaposition of these two films is so incredibly stark.
What's the analogy?
Let's look at this through the lens of sensory input. It's like society has decided to put on a pair of massive, state-sponsored noise-canceling headphones. We are turning the volume all the way up on a 4-hour fictional fantasy where we are invincible, where violence solves everything and the enemy is clearly defined. We are doing this specifically to drown out the very real, very uncomfortable audio of a complex conflict we don't want to process.
Right.
We are eager to consume fictional bloodlust, but our censors have decided we must be shielded from real-world empathy regarding a dying child in Gaza. What does that specific curated media diet do to our collective national psyche over a decade?
If a society only consumes narratives that constantly reinforce its own strength, justify its rage, and demonize the other, while the state systematically erases or suppresses narratives that highlight universal suffering, vulnerability, and complexity, that society risks losing its foundational capacity for critical empathy.
It becomes a society that understands the world exclusively through the rigid lens of power, retaliation, and hierarchy, rather than shared humanity.
The stories we eagerly pay to tell ourselves, and the stories we allow the state to forbid us from seeing, are the truest, most accurate reflection of who we are becoming.
That is a heavy, sobering thought. But it is exactly the kind of critical reflection we aim for here, and it brings us to the end of our journey today. Let's summarize the massive, interconnected amount of ground we've covered in this deep dive.
Let's do it.
We started by tracing the invisible wires of the global economy. We looked at the geopolitics of the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran, and how the theoretical butterfly effect is actually a very real missile effect.
We saw how an Iranian asymmetric drone strike on a Kuwaiti refinery immediately triggers a 22 rupee hike in industrial diesel, raising the cost of your groceries.
We saw how high-level diplomatic posturing over the Strait of Hormuz cuts the supply lines of the Taleim blueprints, leaving master Kashmiri carpet weavers staring at empty looms.
We explored the cold, mathematical calculus of India's strategic autonomy, balancing the vital need for Gulf energy and Israeli defense tech against civilizational ties and the safety of millions of expats.
From those international borders, we zoomed all the way into our domestic zoning laws, exploring the intense, destructive friction between fragile ecology and top-down development.
We saw Goan villagers fighting Section 39A to prevent real estate developers from paving over their laterite hills and destroying their water table.
We looked at the 92,000 crore mega project in Great Nicobar, where the demands for fair financial compensation by ex-servicemen overlap tragically with the silent, existential threat to the uncontacted indigenous Shompen tribe.
We saw the Supreme Court threatening officials with vicarious liability for allowing sand miners to destroy the Shambhala gharial habitats, and we decoded the bureaucratic turf war between the MNRE and the Power Ministry over who controls the variable physics of our renewable energy grid.
All of it coming down to one terrifying question. What is the carrying capacity of our environment?
Then we examine how the very definition of justice and human rights is frantically evolving as the system stresses.
We saw the Supreme Court beautifully redefine the concept of family, not by genetic biology, but by shared meaning and granting full maternity leave to adoptive mothers.
But we also saw the dangerous, clumsy gaps in our new BNS criminal code, accidentally deleting the equivalent of Section 377 and leaving male and LGBTQ+ victims without specific legal remedies for assault.
We discussed a hyperactive judiciary trying to manage hate speech, protect its own institutional optics, and even edit 8th grade textbooks, while states like Chhattisgarh resort to 10-year jail terms to stop exam cheating.
All of this echoing the century-long fight for basic dignity represented by Ambedkar's Mahad Satyagraha.
And finally, we looked at the cultural mirror. We contrasted the mainstream box office success of a hyper-violent, state-aligned revenge fantasy film with the bureaucratic, orbital censorship of an Oscar-nominated documentary about a real child killed in Gaza.
We asked what this curated diet of fictional jingoism and suppressed empathy is doing to our collective psyche.
Through all of this, the connecting thread is you, the listener. You pay the inflated freight prices at the grocery store. You live in the neighborhoods vulnerable to flooding when the hills are paved. Your fundamental rights are being redefined or accidentally deleted in those courtrooms.
And your view of the world is being aggressively shaped by the media you are allowed or forbidding to consume.
You are the ultimate stakeholder in these overlapping systems.
And that reality leads perfectly into a final thought I want to leave you to mull over today.
Okay, lay it on us.
Throughout this deep dive, we've seen exactly how laws are rewritten to fundamentally change the definition of a forest, a crime, or a family. We've seen how geopolitical borders are contested with asymmetric drone strikes and how modern histories are manipulated for the cinema screen.
Right.
But consider this mechanism as the state, not just in India, but globally, gains increasingly sophisticated technological, bureaucratic, and legal power to centrally shape everything from the electricity running through our grid to the history printed in our school textbooks. What happens to the power of the individual? In a world that is hyper-connected by fragile global supply chains, yet deeply divided by rigid state-sponsored nationalistic narratives, will the citizen of tomorrow retain the agency to be an active, democratic participant in shaping society? Or are we being slowly, systematically conditioned to simply sit in the dark and be captive audience members watching the movie play out?
That is a phenomenal, deeply unsettling question to end on. From the murky diagnostic X-ray of global geopolitics to the stories we tell ourselves in the dark. Keep questioning the official narratives, keep tracing the mechanics of the systems around you, and never stop trying to connect the dots. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take care.